thank you Grant, Alistair, Ray. I have to tell you it's the first time that I've been introduced earlier on when you said that you're going to let everybody know that I was on fire. So I'm thinking, oh my God, the bar is just being set up here. So I will truly attempt in the next 15, 20 minutes, ish. Tell me if I'm going on too long to get us to that place. It really is a very genuine pleasure to be here today, to share food with you, to have an opportunity to talk and to listen. I really genuinely appreciate it. I do want to acknowledge I was coming in here worried that I was late, wondering if I'm in exactly the right place, and I saw Grant outside, and I just actually want to acknowledge how important that was to me in that moment. So for your hospitality and care, thank you.
You're welcome. They just wouldn't let me in. So.
Yeah. You had to hang out outside and enjoy the beautiful morning and however fresh it was, but just an acknowledgement that really did make quite a difference, so thank you. One of the realities of being part of the mission is that when I walk into rooms like this or meet to have a conversation with people, I'm always unsure about how much people know about the mission. The mission is 102 years old, unbelievably, here in Auckland. And what that means is that many people who have grown up in Auckland have kind of grown up with the mission. And often we're known for Christmas Day meetings and for our work with people who are suffering the reality of homelessness. And it's an opportunity here for me actually, just as we talk about the much bigger breadth actually of the work of the mission, our purpose, our history and whakapapa, and actually our view into the next 100 years. And particularly today I have the pleasure of talking a little bit about Homeground, our brand new home. I don't know if any of you have driven past Hobson Street of recent times. If you did, we're located, there's St Matt's Church, which is on the corner of Hobson Street and Wellesley Street, and there's an infamous car park next to it. And then we are literally the building next to it. And now it is hard to miss us because we are an 11-storey complex and a beautiful red brick building on the outside. So this talks a little bit here about who we are and what we do actually and our values. So that's the beautiful brick building. You can see that white building there is the Prince of Wales pub. So that actually is a very, very old original building and historic building, which is why we have kept it. And I talk about it that it's like our umbilical cord. Takes us back to our history. We bought that pub as a totally and utterly derelict pub in 1980. So we're talking about you had to have gumboots to walk over the glass and the wood. Managed to kind of put a bit together actually, but over time it just became impossible. Both the quality and the kind of the breadth of the space was just totally and wildly inadequate. So the dream for Homeground actually began 15 years ago, and I need to acknowledge a number of people, Dame Helen Robinson, who was the missioner before Sir Chris Farrelly before me, and then myself. It took 3 missioners to get us here, and an extraordinary board, and particularly acknowledge Bishop Jim White, who was the chair of the board, who really led this and sadly died 2 years ago. So he managed to lay the Modi stone during 2 years ago, but didn't get to see the building opened. And so then our chair of the board now is a woman called Joanna Pigeon. So it's taken 2 chairs and 3 missioners to get us here. And all of Auckland, and in fact, all of New Zealand. We work in 3 main areas. So the mission over time actually changes what we do. And it's not because we wake up one morning and decide we're wildly bored. What I have been tasked with or charged with, and in fact all missioners before me, is to actually simply, and it's sometimes harder than it sounds, to see the face of suffering in Auckland and respond. And dare to ask the question, why is that suffering occurring? And hopefully, in daring to ask that question, create a change in the structures or the systems that is not responding to that suffering, so that that suffering is no longer. a really, really good example is that I'm wildly proud of is that the mission opened the first HIV/AIDS hospital in our country at a time when literally the New Zealand health system wouldn't touch people, and that's figuratively and literally would not touch people. And incredibly proud of the work that the mission did, and we had a hospital in Ponsonby. That then closed in the early 2000s when the New Zealand health system was actually beginning to, or took over actually, the appropriate care of people who are HIV positive. So it's a good example that the mission responded and stepped into a need because the need was there, but also let it go when the need was no longer there. So the three areas of need that we're deeply involved in at the moment that really speak to the face of suffering in Auckland is the reality of homelessness, the reality of people not having enough money for food, and the reality that many people don't have access to appropriate health care. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of that, very, very simply, 9 years ago when I started at the mission, so I've had a number of different roles at the mission, we distributed 9,000 food parcels to people across Auckland. Now every one of those food parcels feeds a family of 4 for 3 meals for 4 days. So you get kind of a sense of how it rolls. In the last financial year, that's obviously just finished in June, we distributed just under 65,000. So in a 9-year period, we have gone from 9,000 to 65,000. And what that shows is that there are many people in Auckland who are literally hungry. Now, people often confuse homelessness and food insecurity, and sometimes they do go together. But to get a food parcel at the mission, you actually have to have a street address. Now, no great philosophy behind that, just if we're giving people food, they need a place to store or cook it. And if you're very vulnerably housed or living on the street, you don't have a place to store or cook it. And we have other services that respond to those needs. So those 65,000 parcels, we actually worked out the other day that it's 3 million meals, which is a bit staggering when even I think about it, are actually just going to ordinary Aucklanders who most often simply just do not have enough money going in against what needs to go out. And that's particularly the disproportionate cost of housing. So in a limited income, when housing is 60, 70, 80% of your income, people pay for the rent and the mortgage, they pay for electricity, power, gas, send the kids to school, the doctors if they need to, and then food becomes what we call the discretionary item, that last item on the list. So I have gone on record, and again we'll go on record today to say that New Zealand is in the grip of a hunger crisis. About 20% of us across New Zealand don't have enough money for food every day. And we're doing huge amounts of work, particularly at government level, to actually help people understand this reality. And what I'm very genuinely worried about is that during COVID we received the first amount of government funding to help us do that, because it's big money. We're talking trucks and fridges and freezers and logistics and distribution centres, and big money on food to feed that kind of number. But all that money from the government stops on the 30th of June next year. So, because our COVID budget ends. So very, very clearly New Zealand will see social unrest like we have not seen unless we are prepared to do something. It's one thing when people don't have enough home, it's a whole other thing when people are hungry. What happens? So there's not a fabulous good news story I have to tell you in terms of our work with food. And just why it's just so incredibly important what's happening. Our healthcare has 2 particular services that we kind of ground or locate our services in. We have a primary healthcare centre called the Calder Centre, which is named after Jasper Calder, who was the first Auckland City Missioner. So I'm the 10th, 102 years ago he was the first. It's always lovely saying his name. And if you lived in Auckland City, I'd say come and roll. It's just a medical centre, like the medical centre that you go to. It's relatively small, so there's just under 2,000 people who are enrolled there. About 2/3 of the people who are enrolled there are either literally street homeless or very, very vulnerably housed. So in emergency housing or transitional housing or boarding houses. places whilst people await permanent housing. A number of years ago we were declared the highest need clinic in the country. So you do get a sense of the level of vulnerability. It's not rocket science to think that if you are homeless, that actually affects your health, both physically and mentally. So the average age of mortality in New Zealand is 82. The average age of mortality at the Quarter Centre is 55. So that gives you a sense that actually being homeless affects your body. And so if you are 50, you actually have health conditions of a 70-year-old is usually the kind of the litmus test of how it goes. So the Quarter Centre is super important, and you can imagine during the pandemic what that enabled us to do. We were able to take both testing and vaccination literally to the street. So it was, I'm super proud of us, and a super cool thing that we were able to do, to be creative and responsive to a population that by and large trust has been broken with our current health system, so wouldn't access services in a way that you or I might. We have a social detox unit that is on level 3 of this building. We'll always point you out level 3, 1, 2, 3. This is our social detox unit here. So detox, 15% of New Zealand has an alcohol or any other drug problem. Alcohol was always our drug of choice. Has been for a long time, and I suspect will continue to be. And quite kind of revolutionary when you think, gosh, 15% of us in Auckland do have an alcohol or drug problem and need support. By the time you get to a detox unit, what happens is when someone says, I want to stop using alcohol or any other drug, because my body has got used to that drug, it's physiologically, it's a very, very difficult thing, let alone psychologically, to stop that alcohol or drug coming into my body, so I need support. So what actually happens in this brand new building is the medical detox service. So we have a hospital level floor and we have our floor. And between those two floors there are 25 people every night who go to sleep in Homeground, who are being supported in that journey. So what happens is people come to us at that immediate moment. So often people would literally arrive under the influence, and then they are with us in that detox period. And depending on the amount and kind of drug someone is using, they may need to go to medical detox, which is 24-hour nurses and doctors, or they may be able to go straight to social detox, which is highly supportive but does not have that 24-hour medical care. Now, those two detox floors is all we have in Auckland. So if you think there's 1 million of us, you think 150,000 of us need help, and there's 25 beds. So you get a bit of a sense of what I would actually say is New Zealand's denial about the impact of our alcohol problem. So again, wildly proud. Often people think, oh, that's for people who are homeless. At any one time in our detox unit, we'd only have 1 of 15 people in there who are rough sleepers. So actually, this is just ordinary Auckland. And it's the deep level of shame that people often feel. We're really, really clear that this is a health issue, not a criminal issue, and that we are working towards that as much as we can. And so then I go to our housing services. We have a whole range. Part of the beauty here, and I think I can move to this next actually, nearly next, is in this building here, we have, I'll talk much about that, actually a home for 80 people. So as the story for Homeground goes, it was 3 iterations. The first one died in the global financial crisis. We had a grand building. The board just could not countenance the risk associated with growing or creating such a large building, and so the project literally died. A couple of years after the global financial crisis, we went for iteration number 2. It's like Goldilocks and 3 beers, by the way. Iteration number 2 was just for our administration. And we went to Auckland and said, help us Auckland. And Auckland said, you can't ask us to pay for a building just for you lot. If you've been talking about homelessness, why don't you do something about it? So very humbly, we kind of had to go back to the drawing board, and what you see here in Homeground is iteration number 3. So part of the extraordinary gift of this building, or possibility, is that there are 80 permanent apartments So we know that the deal breaker to ending homelessness is not more transitional houses or more emergency houses, it's permanent homes. That's the thing that shifts the dial. And particularly what's important here for Homeground is that it's what's called a supportive model. So there's actually a 24-hour social worker on 7 days a week and a 24-hour security guard. And what it's designed for in those 80 apartments is 40 people in there are people who are, have a very high level of need. So very clinically, to qualify, they need to be rough sleeping for more than 1 year with 2 comorbidities. So people who are physically unwell, mentally unwell, active addiction, cognitive impairment, a brain injury, significant trauma. So we're really designed this building to deal with some of New Zealand's most vulnerable and needy people, hence needing the 24-hour social worker and the 24-hour security guard. The 24-hour nature is super interesting. Often I've found it's at 3 o'clock in the morning that life gets complicated, and it's very hard to call a social worker at 3 o'clock in the morning, so that's kind of partly what this is designed for. And secondly, that our experiences teaches us that often I could be really in a good space in my life and ready to live permanently, but after a number of years on the street, I come with a lot of other people. And those lot of other people sometimes create complicated behaviour that often impacts the long-term tenancy of a particular individual. So by having a security guard there, we can actually support that individual to say, isn't it lovely to see you? It's now time for you to go away. So that, out the door, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So it's this lovely balance of support and containment. Now what's really special about this model is it's the first of its kind in New Zealand. We've taken it from Australia, who took it from New York, so we kind of follow a deep lineage and we're following a model called Homeground. I'm really wildly proud that the mission actually, this is quite clearly an act of sovereignty on our behalf. We're actually saying we need to home our people and we will do it ourselves. With Auckland, it's only Auckland that can ever enable us to do this. We are a community housing provider, which is, some of you may know how this works, but we can't just wake up in the morning and decide to say that we want to house people. We've got to go through a whole process. And what that means is that we actually have other permanent housing throughout Auckland City too. We have a building in Day Street, just off K Road, where 60 people live, and we are the landlord to a further 60 people scattered throughout Auckland in individual dwellings. So by the end of the year we'll have over 200 tenancies, and that will just continue to grow as we kind of really say that yes, we will work with New Zealand and Auckland to literally provide appropriate permanent housing. Great. We have transitional housing services, so we have 3 of those throughout Auckland. So that's for people in a 3-month period. We have a very special one called Te Wharehina Tori, which is the kaupapa Māori service for women, run by women in Franklin Road, the Christmas tree lights. So when you go down Franklin Road, know that you're supporting the mission. A large one called James System Hospital in Howe Street, and another one in Union Street. We have a service at the mission here on our ground floor called Hayata, where we provide a meal like this every day, breakfast. On a busy day we can have 300 people through. So that would be for people who can't access a food parcel. So you're talking about people who are in boarding houses, emergency hotels, literally living on the street. So the fact that 300 people are coming through a day give you a sense of the level of need that's in Central City Auckland. We have an outreach team, so people who go out to people on the street. So the teams across the mission could probably tell you the name of every individual in Central City Auckland, give or take, of everyone who is rough sleeping. So our job is to literally be in relationship with people. And then there's a whole heap of back of house services that provide that support. So this is part of Homeground. On the very top floor, I was going to say, is that we have a conference facility there in a room that can sit 100 of you. If you'd ever like to come, have a meeting, we would like to have you there. Partly it's a way that we can bring people into the building, but it's also a way that the mission can raise income. It's also this is the place because like the residents have both an inside area and an outside area on that top floor. So the building is 11 stories. There's a car park or a basement, ground floor of our services, our admin, 2 floors of detox, 5 floors of apartments, and the rooftop, which is beautiful. And you can see out, we have like an enviable view of Sky City and St. Matt's, and just this glimpse of the harbour and the harbour bridge too. So we would love to welcome you there. It is truly a beautiful building. I have stood at the Property Council of New Zealand this year to accept the Supreme Award. Quite extraordinary that the Mission won a Property Council Award. I think it's probably the first and perhaps only time in our history, and future we will. I stood with the builders to receive the Supreme Award for building in New Zealand. On November the 17th, I'm going down to Christchurch for the New Zealand Architecture Awards. So in terms of property, design, architecture, building, this is an extraordinary building. It's extraordinary because of what it is, but certainly for me it's extraordinary for what happens on the inside. And I think where I do want to leave you, and I'm happy to take questions if there's time, is that the cost of this building was 110 million. We started with 8. And I tell the story of a critical time when we had to sign the building contract. At that stage the building was going to be 90 million, so this is about 4 or 5 years ago. Our cost escalation is not my friend. And at that stage the board had 37 million. So if you can imagine what it would be like to be a board member knowing that you had 37 million at the cost of 90 million, and the utter courage and tenacity of the board that, not in stupidity and quite a lot of care, said we will believe that Auckland will support us. And about 5 months ago I received the last $5 million so that we have opened Homeground debt free. It's an extraordinary achievement, and we have only been able to do that very genuinely because of people like you. Certainly because of Rotary, who has supported us in all kinds of ways, but individuals who have just given generously. So I'm here with a very, very humble and grateful heart to say thank you for making a dream very real. We only did it because of you. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much, and thank you, you're willing to take some questions. So, here we go.
So, is it your accommodation that you can provide in there, the detox and those ones, is it the tip of the iceberg?
Absolutely.
I mean, the number of beds that you have,
Yes.
seems to me, I used to drive up Hobson Street at times, quite early in the morning and whatnot, see them all lining up, waiting to go in. Is it the tip of the iceberg?
Totally. So there are 40,000 people in our country today who are homeless. Let's sit with that, 40,000. About 2/3 of that in Auckland, so 27,000 people. So that definition of homelessness or severely housing deprived, as Stats New Zealand said, includes people in like 10 people living in a house designed for 3, so overcrowding. Also includes inappropriate dwellings, so people who are living in garages without sanitation or electricity, and then people who are literally without security of tenure. So our boarding houses, you could literally live in a boarding house for 25 years, same room, and the boarding house owner could come and say you have 5 hours to get out. So that lack of security of tenure, and then of course people who are literally rough sleeping. So when we opened Homeground, and we opened the doors on the 11th of February and opened the apartments, our first person slept here on the 11th of April, I could have filled it twice over on that first night. So rough sleeping is obviously the most vulnerable end of that 40,000, but easily today, in any one year, we would deal with probably about 500 unique individuals that need permanent housing. So we just need houses, team. Not just the Mission, New Zealand needs affordable, appropriate dwellings. So it's a good question.
Okay.
When people get into the apartments and you give them, do they have to donate pay something?
Yeah, so the nature of, it's a good question. The nature of social housing works in New Zealand. We are what's called a social housing provider. So we're a CHIP, a community housing provider that provides social housing. So that's the kind of box we had to tick. And we're quite regulated, and appropriately regulated, by the way. So what that means is to be on the social housing register, you have to pass a test at MSD. So if you were homeless tonight, I would say, come with me to work and income, and they would ask you a whole heap of questions that you would either qualify to be on the social housing register or not. And it's quite a high threshold to qualify. Once you are on that, what that means is that you have an ability to access social housing. And how that works is that we pay 25% of our benefit, or an individual would pay, you pay 25% of your benefit towards the cost of your housing, and the government pays the balance of the market rent to the CHIP. So let's say the cost of rent for one of those rooms is $200 a week, and the benefit is $200. It's nowhere near as simple as this, but to give you a sense, $50 would come from the individual, from their benefit to the mission, and then the government would pay the $150 market rent. So what that means for us is that we can literally afford to pay for the social housing, but what it means for the individual is that it's not crippling. So international kind of assessment says 25 to 30% of someone's income is an appropriate amount of money to spend on their housing costs. So that's why it's set at that market. So yes, 25% of their benefit.
I mean, it's giving them something that they know they have to.
Oh, well, everyone's got to pay for the cost of housing appropriately. But with that rest of that money, you've got to pay your electricity and water and food and everything else.
How do you stop the logjam? Because I can see, because I work in aged care, and I can see immediately once people are on the register waiting for an appropriate house, the pressure's gone off yet another government department for you to hold those people.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have a deep belief, and perhaps it's naive, but to share it, that by requiring something of the government, we're actually letting go our responsibility as citizens to contribute towards creating a much bigger reality. In New Zealand, we have homelessness because for 30 years of a lack of investment in social housing. So we're playing catch up now, because we haven't done it for 30 years. Now what's very, very tempting, and I'm all up for holding the governments to account, and I literally do every day, is that we need places like the Kainga Ora or the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development to be providing houses, literally. What we need to be doing as a country is putting huge amounts of heat on them so that they know that politically we are not prepared to accept a country where there is homelessness. And then we need to be super creative, like the mission has here, in saying there is a unique contribution that the mission can give here because of our understanding of working with people who are rough sleepers. So you will have a particular contribution that you can make because of your understanding of working with older people that actually by and large KO or HUD won't have. So how can they work with you to provide the appropriate housing that needs to occur?
We see the counter to that is that in aged care, we have a lot of younger people.
Yes.
They get labelled with a disability, and the easy option is referral, especially when they've got extreme mental health issues. It's a very cheap option.
Yes, it is.
To send people for rest home care with a provider like us, which has got a longer history than the mission even.
Yes.
And I just see a complete absence of responsibility
It's totally.
for the complexity of the care required. And I think you get stuck.
I see that all the day. So what I need to encourage you is for your passion to speak up more.
I do.
Yeah.
I think most people know I'm a pain in the butt.
No, we need you.
Yeah, Roger.
Okay. You mentioned earlier on that you've had a little model from New York to Sydney to here. What about the overall numbers of homeless people in trouble? How do we relate in New Zealand to Australia and to the States?
So it's very, very hard. Proportionately, the States is revolting. Their level of homelessness is. Homelessness is a direct indication of two things actually, the gap between people who have and haven't. So in societies where that gap is large, homelessness is large. And the more a country chooses to see a home as an investment, the more homelessness there is. So there is a growing understanding that the root of homelessness in New Zealand is the moment that we as a country said my house stopped being a home and it became an investment. And that's so that if we could actually start to see that people's houses are actually homes, and that if we are going to invest in anything, we invest in the active economy, not in expecting that another house is a property investment. So Australia, we're about much the same, proportionately. Yeah.
I'm interested in your award-winning buildings. What was the rationale behind having the ability to hold a space for any organisation to rent
At the top,
yeah, up the top?
So one of the realities that we know to be true is that unless you are in relationship with people who are different from you, from me, then people get othered. And in that process of othering, there is a distancing between understanding the need. So the way that homelessness is being maintained in our country is that people have been othered and not in relationship with. Because it's very, very difficult to get to know someone, to look someone in the eye and do nothing. So what we said philosophically is we wanted a building where Auckland comes in. So we've tried to do, there's a public laneway, so that literally, I mean, if you wanted to go there now, between Monday and Friday, 8 to 5, you literally can walk in Hobson Street and walk out Federal Street. And when AATS, when the railway station opens up, so it's becoming a shortcut just down ground floor, let alone the conference centre. So we wanted to say, Auckland, come in, and actually realise this person who is suffering homelessness is one of us.
Sorry, yeah, Annabelle, last
So many
question.
good questions here.
Yeah, yes. Sorry. This is no disrespect to Homeground at
Please,
all,
please.
but I just wanted to know: am I right that you are only actually looking after cases within the Auckland CBD? The reason I ask that is that we had a terrible chap living in our bus shelter a couple of years ago in Royal Oak, and I called. Because I didn't know who else to call,
Yes.
and was told that unfortunately you can't help him
No.
because he's outside the CBD, and he's probably quite lucky to be outside of it. But of course for me, I was looking at a terrible case, and I didn't know what to do. And I wondered if you could perhaps just explain how it works within Homeground and then the wider Auckland
Totally,
region.
totally. It's not disrespectful, Christian. I'm sorry that happened, and it's just the day-to-day reality. This has become quite live of recent times because of the death of the woman in the car in Remuera. You may have heard in the news that there was a woman who was sleeping in the car there. Essentially what happens is we have a team of 5 individuals. So you know when I said about people who go on outreach, to go out to the city, so that their job is to walk the central city environs. And then we stretch as much as possible so that we know people. And the example of that woman in the car is exactly a similar situation to you. Someone rang and said, would you? So what has happened over time is that we started to get calls that go for the whole Auckland council area. So we're talking way up north to way down south. So then what happened is that we started to very genuinely have team members who were travelling 4 or 5 hours a day, and the thing with someone who's rough sleeping, you've got no guarantee they're going to be here. Yeah. And so the way this works is you go regularly and you build relationship. So you try and get there at a time, you get to know their rhythm. Oh gosh, they're always there at 6 p.m, so you make sure you're there at 6 p.m, but you've got no guarantee. So what we did was actually work with the council and say, we can't do this, we can't do all of Auckland. Are there other organisations? So we trained Salvation Army out west so that they could take out west. There is an organisation in South Auckland called Link People who have picked up South Auckland, an organisation in Central City called Kahuri Te Kaha that is taking the more central Auckland, which would be the area that you've taken.
Yeah.
Now I suspect in the time that you've called it was nowhere near as sorted and sophisticated as I've just explained. So I'm really genuinely sorry.
Oh, no,
about
no,
that.
not at all. I was just
Mhm.
curious to know what else was available and whether you all linked up together.
Yes,
Clearly
we
you
do. And so the best place to do is to call the council, who actually are extraordinary in what they do. Now, and then short of that, call the mission, because what our staff should have done is said, gosh, we can't help, but let us find someone who can.
Okay,
Yes.
we appreciate time. So Linda, if you'd like to give thanks, and Helen, if you're able to maybe hang around just
Yeah,
for a
of
couple of
course,
minutes,
of course.
others might be able to.
Lovely, lovely.
Well,
Thank you for your
thanks,
time.
Linda.
Helen, we'd like to thank you and give you this present, and thank you for the time that you've given us today to really explain what the mission does, and also the extraordinary journey that you've had with your building, and how you've been able to increase your level of care to these
My pleasure.